Hi, my name's Chris Summer. I'm a professional artist and I create hyper-realistic acrylic paintings of natural still life subjects, mostly feathers and urchins. In my studio this morning, I am going to briefly show you how I transition from a blurry section of work into a detailed in focus section of work. This is really important in my work because with hyper-realism, it's very easy to flatten the work by creating excess detail. So I use a technique a little bit like focal depth in a camera, referencing photography to create depth in the work, and that helps the detailed section lift and jump off the page, which helps create a bit of looseness and a bit of dynamic to the work. So bear in mind, I am a professional working artist. I am not a content creator. I know there's an overlap, but my priority is the studio, so I work with what I have. This is my studio setup. So I've got the painting that I'm currently working on. There's a board backed onto this so I can lean on the canvas without stretching it. I've got my floating table here, which has two water pots. I think it's 8 AM and we're already at 32 degrees, so 90 Fahrenheit for anyone listening in the US. I'm a big believer in making things work for you and being creative with your setup. So I've got a splashback here, which I've just taped onto the table. I've got a clamp holding on the tissue, and I got this bit of MDF and I've put some nails in it, which means I can separate the brushes. So in this instance, because of the section I'm working on, I've got the brushes which are old and frayed, which I use for the blurry section, and then I've got the brushes which are new and fine and sharp. I don't use expensive brushes. I like to replace them super regular. Obviously I've got my reference here. I reference from multiple images, but this is the image that we'll be mainly working on today. It's a warm day in South Australia today, so I'm hoping to put an inset of a close-up of the work so you can see me work as I'm going through the process. And I'm hoping to shoot that on my camera. So we'll see if that works. This is the studio today. I've got the blinds mostly down because of how warm it is. And the bearded dragon is hanging out, but she doesn't even need the heat lamp on this morning. She's quite happy in the shade at the moment. And the light's on to boost the luminosity, because obviously it's a bit darker in here with the blinds down. So we'll get to it, and I'll start. We're going to do this in three sections basically. Obviously the blurry soft, the detailed, and then a transition section in the middle. So speaking of making things work for you, this is my palette, which I basically got from a cheap storage, just a plastic craft container with a lid, which means I can keep the paints dry. And my actual palette itself is a Panadol medicine pack. It's great. I love the little wells. It keeps a small amount of paint with a low surface area, which just stops them drying out. I work with tiny bits of paint anyway, and so it just means I can keep the paint wet for much longer. So for this section I'll be using two brushes, basically two old frayed brushes. They're quite small, 3-0 and 5-0. But because they're so frayed, they have a larger surface area than when they were new. And basically what we're going to do is just go over the work that we've already done. This section's quite simple. We don't need to worry about detail or texture too much. It's just really about wet blending and softening over the tones that are already there. So it's important when you're painting an out of focus area, just the same as any rule of composition or landscape with far distant horizon or anything like that. Anything that's in the distance, anything that you want to recede and not jump forwards, then you reduce the tonal contrast so that there isn't any draw of the eye. The goal for this is to make it as soft and as subtle as possible so it recedes. Then when we do the detail later on, that's really going to help lift that off the page, which is the dynamic that we're looking for. And so the highlight really here, I'm just sort of using my fourth tone along the range. That's an important dynamic with this work. What I'll do often is, even though we want to follow the structure that we've underpainted underneath, we don't want to match the tones exactly, because if we're matching the tones exactly, we're just going to create a bit of contrast, because we're going to be using specific tones. Whereas what I like to do is, as I'm putting a light tone down, is just with a sort of dry brush, which you'll often see me dry the brush off on the paper towel with a dry brush, just glaze over and just dust over the top of some darker tones, and that'll just edge them back. And that just helps just soften that contrast, really reduce it, and just help bring the whole thing backwards, or take the whole things backwards. Now, it's obviously important to paint what you see in terms of your reference, but also don't forget this is a work of art. So we have full creative license to make sure that we are painting it how it feels good, so that it looks peaceful to the eye in terms of composition, and we can adjust levels of blur and focus and contrast to lead the eye. It's really important to build up those glazes on the blurry section, because that's what's really gonna soften everything down. And so we are decreasing contrast in the blurry section, so we're decreasing the difference between the highlights and the lowlights, and as we move into the focus section, we're going to increase the fineness of the brush. So we're going to get a sharper, tighter brush, and that's just going to help us represent focus and fine detail, and we're going to transition that as we go. Now, what I try and do is I try not to transition both of those at the same time. So if you're going from blurry to what I described as the transition section before the focus, I won't make a change of both contrast and brush at the same point in the work, because that's just going to increase the change too rapidly, especially for something as soft and delicate as a feather. So what I'll actually do is I'll probably change the brush first, then work for another centimetre or so, then start to change the contrast, so that there's a bit more of an overlap, and that's going to help really create that gradual transition of blur to focus. So with the blurry section finished, I'm now shifting to a new 3-0 brush, so it's a lot sharper than the brush that I was using before. And we're going to use this to start doing the base for both the transition section and the detailed section. Now, it's really important here for me to remind myself to stay true to the form. I don't really want to be painting down each strand, because as I move along the strands, I'm not going to be able to represent how light falls across the form accurately. So I want to work in sections. So you'll notice that I've made some marks in some of the lines, and that's to remind me where I'm shifting to darker parts and where the light is falling. And this is also the main reason that I use this brush to do the base for both the transition and the focal area, because if I did the focal area with a sharp, fine brush to represent detail without really honing in the transition of light across this surface, there's no way while you're painting that fine detail that you can also get that subtle transition that goes across the, that glimmer of the edge of a feather within a very short tonal range. None of these tones are particularly dark. I'm not using any blacks. I'm barely using anything above a dark mid-tone. And so there's very little room to move, and the background work is essential to getting that light transition before we move on and do the detail. And so this brush is just right for edging into the blurry section. It's just big enough to edge into the blurry section, and I'll overlap it into the blurry section a bit, so there's a nice gentle transition. But also what I'm doing, as you can see, is I'm moving the brush in a way that is also creating complexity. It's not just flat tones, it's not just lines and sharp edges. We are creating texture underneath, so that as I lay detail on the top, I only need to lay parts of detail, and whatever is still showing underneath, these dark tones that are going to show through underneath, are still going to show complexity. And that's exactly why we're putting down a darker tone here than it looks like I might need. In the soft section, I got to the stage where I was using probably a tone 3 for the highlight. Here I'm putting down tone 4, and that is too dark for the section. But what that means is when I put detail over the top, then that detail can be tone 3 to start with, and then I can just boost it with say tone 2, and just lift it. I don't want to continue the tone 3 up from the blurry section, because then when I'm doing highlights on top of that, I'm going to have to go so bright that we're edging into the brightest tone, the full white, and that is going to force those beautiful highlights in those water droplets to not look so glassy. And so we're really trying to be respectful of the whole work and to keep these tones vibrant and you know, luminous and captivating, but with a subtlety that helps our main focus points still jump off the page. And as my demonstration of this section is about to end, you can just see in this part that I'm doing here, the reason I chose 2 sections is because I can just show you the variety of tones that I'm putting down to describe that transition of light. And to block all that in didn't actually take too long, and so now I'm still using the 3-0 sharp brush, but I'm also using a 5-0 sharp brush, and basically we're just going to do the transition section, and the transition is basically gesturing at detail. We're not doing anything really sharp, we're not doing anything really contrasted, we're not getting away from that soft area too much, but we're just creating a nice transition so that we can do the detail. And I'll extend the transition area further than I need, because then when I do the detail, again, it's always nice to have that overlap, so there's a really gradual transition. I don't just want to stop using the 3-0 brush and start using, you know, my tiny 20-0, because it's just going to be too sharp a transition. And so basically this exactly here is we're just going over the darker undertone with the gesture of detail to create that transition. So here's how it's looking so far. We've got that transition section done. It's looking nice and natural and varied, with some beautiful variances in light. The transition section, we're going to use the 3-0 brush to do the base of the fine section, and then we're just going to add the fine brush over the top. So I'm using a 10-0 for this, a nice sharp new 10-0, and just giving you an example here of how that will look in that space where I'm going to overlap the two. So it's just taking the fine brush, taking some lighter tones, and just using nice fine sharper lines to lay over the top. I'll be using a nice wet paint for that, just to make sure it flows off the brush nicely to get those fine sharper details. And you can see in this section here where we've got these really nice subtle transitions in tone, and basically that's having the darker background. The darker background is allowing us, not only even when we're using the 3-0 brush, to get the lighting right and create that transition area. It allows us to get some variance in there. It's not, obviously when we use the 3-0 brush, we weren't painting down solid form, so there is some of that dark tone showing through. But what that dark tone is also allowing us to do is just choose sections where we just don't highlight it as much, or just don't put quite so much detail in, and it's a really, really subtle variance, but it gives us the opportunity to show those slight grades in light, which obviously is vital for painting this kind of form like a feather. But I won't be using the fine brush by itself on the main body of the feather, and that you can see that when we use it here, in that when we put just the fine brush down, it really will just look too sharp. And so in the same principle as before, I will be working in sections rather than down each line, to make sure that I can capture the light appearance, or how I'm representing that significant section of the feather, and so I can remember exactly what base tone I used, exactly what brush I used, and exactly what highlight paint I used, and how many layers I went over it to build up that highlight. We'll jump forward now to when I finish that section, and then I can show you a bit of a before and after where we started at the beginning of this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you got something out of this. Feel free, if you have any questions, to drop me an email. or if you enjoy my content, subscribe or follow my Instagram, and thank you so much for watching.